let me welcome also our distinguished panelists who are going to appear shortly on the screen, and all the people who are tuning in to watch this session online. So welcome to all of you. We have an opportunity for the next 50 minutes to have a conversation about a topic that is really a very important issue in economics. It's an important issue socially, it's an important issue politically, and that is the question of inequality. Inequality amongst countries, so between different countries in the world, inequality within countries, what has been happening to this. And if you look back at the last 40 years, what you see is that globally there has been a reduction in inequality because many countries have been, developing countries have been growing faster than the countries that were richer. And so there has been a process of what economists like to call convergence, that their income's getting a little bit closer. But we've also seen that in many countries over the same period, inequality has risen within the countries, between people. And so as you measure this in different ways, this has been increasing. But the experience has not been the same in every region or in every country. And that's why we have with us today really a very distinguished panelist, group of panelists. And we have, and let me just introduce them briefly and then I will turn to them. We have Albert Park, who is the Chief Economist and the Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation at the Asian Development Bank. This is a multilateral bank, as you know, and it deals with a number of countries in Asia, including Kazakhstan. Then we go from Asia to Latin America, and we have Eric Parado, who is the Chief Economist and also the General Manager of the Research Department of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is looking at the countries in Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Then we have Eric Bergloff. Eric Bergloff is the Chief Economist of the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is based in Beijing. It's a very recent addition to the family of multilateral and regional development banks, but it's already become very active and distinguished itself, and one of the secrets of its success has been to recruit very good people like Eric as its first Chief Economist. And Eric was also, for many years, the Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So he was very intimately involved in helping the countries of the former Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe transition towards a market economy. And finally, we have Rolf Strack, who is the Chief Economist and member of the Management Board of the European Stability Mechanism. And I'm very glad that Rolf has also joined this panel, because what we will see is that the issue of inequality is not an issue only for developing countries or transition economies, but in many ways is just as important an economic and social and, as I said, political issue in European countries and in rich countries around the world. So that's the distinguished panel. What I was hoping we might do is have one round where I ask each of our panelists to give a little bit their perspective, looking at it from the countries in their region, because the experience across the regions varies. What lessons can we draw about inequality? What can we say from that perspective? Then, hopefully, if they're as quick in reality as they promise to be when we discuss this, then we will also have time for a second round, which will be to drill down a little bit more on what can be done to address some of these issues, including by international institutions. So that's a little bit the plan, and I know that Rolf wants to use a couple of slides when he talks about that, but hopefully that'll all work with the technology. So with that, and without the benefit myself of being able to see any of these panelists, so I am speaking on faith that they are all indeed here, let me ask Albert Park to lead off, please, and give us a little bit the perspective of what's been happening in the countries and the region that he is most familiar with. So, Albert, if you are online, could I turn to you now to take 5 minutes and give us your perspective?
Yes, I'm here. I hope people can hear me.
We can hear you very clearly.
I'm assuming. Excellent. Okay. So, it's a very challenging time in Asia, as it is throughout the globe. We know that the pandemic increased inequality both across countries and especially within countries. And so one of the key features in Asia is that the recovery has been very uneven, although overall has been reasonably robust. Although we're pretty concerned this year that a lot of the growth projections are heading downward. But within countries too, there was a huge impact. We know that workers in the informal sector, women, young people were more impacted by the pandemic, people who were not digitally connected in general. And governments have been trying to respond to those shocks with redistributionary policies, but now with inflation hitting, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, heightened commodity prices, and several years of extensive spending, I think everyone's feeling the pinch and the difficulty to continue addressing some of these inequality issues while also maintaining macro stability, meeting debt burdens, etc. So it's a very challenging time. So leaders are going to have to make very difficult choices and need to be very smart in how they target the resources that they can spend to continue helping the most vulnerable groups, which we think, of course, continues to be extremely important. I wanted to, another thing I wanted to emphasize in terms of the shocks is, we've been doing quite a lot of work in our research plan about the learning losses affecting children in Asia. And in Asia, schools were closed for much longer than most of the rest of the world, and there was a lot of variation. And so we project that there's quite a bit of lost learning that will affect future labor productivity and even aggregate growth if these issues are not addressed with some urgency across the region. I wanted to, though, point to a couple of areas which I think are really important for Asia and I think globally to put a very high priority on moving forward, both to address issues related to pandemic recovery and dealing with high commodity prices, but also just more generally thinking, looking through these crises to the medium and longer term. The first is globalization. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion recently about deglobalization, reshoring, friendshoring, having political clubs, trade with each other. We know we've had sanctions, first U.S.-China trade war, and now sanctions against Russia. And so there's a lot of concern about globalization. In Asia, of course, countries have really benefited historically from globalization through export-led growth and development. And at the ADB, we're very committed to doubling down on globalization and both regional economic integration and global integration. And in Central Asia, of course, we've been a partner for some years in the Central Asia Regional Cooperation Program, the CARIC program, which we think is a very important one. And one of the reasons I think globalization is really important is that both in terms of inter-country inequality, global value chains really provide an opportunity for the poorest countries to get a foothold into global markets by entering value chains in the areas that they can produce efficiently. Maybe at the beginning it's simple processing, but as they gain capacities, they can encompass increasingly large shares of the global value chain. It's a very important way for poorer countries to get engaged and to increase their productivity. But also, globalization can promote growth broadly, and that can, if it's done smartly, can also produce jobs for less skilled workers in export-oriented economies, and especially with digital platforms, small and medium firms can also access these opportunities. So it can actually also reduce inequality within countries if the countries are doing the right things. And so that leads to my second and third areas. What else do countries need to do? One thing is to really invest in digitalization and make sure that digital divides do not leave large vulnerable groups behind. Because if people can get access to digital economic activity, if poor people can do that in services or whatever, it can really be a boon. And also, especially for small and medium-scale firms, if they can enter digital platforms, it can be a huge boost. We know that digital services trade is growing the fastest among services trade, and services are growing faster than manufacturing. So it really is the trend of the future. And it's interesting that both digitalization and globalization, if you look at the experience during the pandemic, they've made countries more resilient as well. In other words, if you are more integrated into global value chains, and if you were more digitally developed or had a higher amount of digital services trade, these countries fared better when big economic shocks hit. They were more resilient. So there's none of this kind of concern, I think, that globalization is kind of creating less resilience. In fact, I think globalization increases resilience. And of course, to go along with all of that is the importance of investing in human capital, which is really very complementary to both digitalization and globalization. So let me just stop there with those thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ahmed. I think we will come back on your point about digitalization. I think Eric will probably want to pick up a little bit on that. And I'd also like in the second round, if I may, to come back to your robust defense of globalization, because there are many people now, certainly in the political sphere, who think that globalization, the process of globalization as it has unfolded, has actually resulted in an increase in intra-country inequality. That inequality has risen within countries in part. And I think it's important to give a response to that, because for all the reasons that you set out. So we might drill down a little bit more on that in the second round. Let me go, as I said, from Asia now all the way across to Latin America, and ask Eric Parado, if you're online, Eric, to please give us a little bit your perspective. Now, I should say that you work on a region that has traditionally had very high levels of inequality within countries. And it'll be interesting to get your sense of whether there are any special lessons one can draw from that, but also how recent events and the unfolding of the pandemic and then subsequent food and energy crisis is playing into the existing inequality problems in the region. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Masood, for your introduction. And thank you very much for the Astana International Financial Center invitation, and a special thanks to Governor Kalimbetov and his team for organizing the Astana Finance Days. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Astana with my colleagues talking about the challenges of several regions in the world. Before answering your question, let me give you some context from the Latin American, the Caribbean perspective. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the region suffered what we call a triple sudden stop. Not only a stop on capital flows, but also a stop on trade and also in mobility. So that was a special crisis that we suffered in 2020. And that's why we have a really severe economic recession. If you compare the world average in terms of economic growth and also in terms of how to deal with the COVID-19 health crisis, we didn't do a good job in 2020. Governments, despite that, reacted rapidly with fiscal support as well as active monetary and financial policies to mitigate the crisis. While the loss in GDP was the largest in a single year in recorded history in 2020, these policies, together with successes in fighting the virus, set the stage for faster recovery in 2021. In the months before the Russia-Ukraine war, GDP was rebounding while employment was lagging. Job losses had been particularly acute for women, workers in the informal sector, and those with less education. As a result, poverty and inequality had grown and are unlikely to resume the declining trend enjoyed during the 2003-2013 commodity boom. While higher commodity prices are generally associated with lower poverty and inequality in the region, lower growth and higher inflation will likely reduce the real income of poorer households. And let me give you some numbers. The bottom 50% earn 27 times less than the top 10% in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you compare to Europe, that number is 9 times instead of 27. While wages were the main driver of inequality reductions before the pandemic, employment was the key driver of the increase in inequality because of the COVID-19 impact. So now governments should focus on programs to mitigate the impact of the crisis on both inequality and poverty, looking at the labor markets. And that's an important message that we're trying to transmit in the recent months. The good thing is that to offset the shock of the COVID-19 crisis, governments rapidly put in place almost 200 income support policies, the majority cash transfer programs to help poorer households and to complement existing programs. However, the existing safety net had been designed to deal with the structural poverty and not with transitory shocks that affected vulnerable households above the poverty line. So this is another challenge that we have, I would say, in our particular region. The COVID-19 crisis pushed many of these families back into poverty, in part of this limited coverage of the transfers and the relatively short duration of the response. The expansion of income support policies is estimated to have reduced the incidence of poverty by 2 percentage points, while recent data suggests extreme poverty have begun to fall, but other measures of poverty remain above the pre-crisis level. And I have to say that the evidence was also emerging of persistent job losses in the sectors most vulnerable to automation. I think this is common in different regions. And apparently the crisis accelerated the trend towards adopting new technology, which impacted, of course, labor markets. And at the same time, the region was emerging from the COVID-19 crisis with more debt, less fiscal space, and higher inflation. So ammunitions from the public sectors are low, so we're calling for an active role from the private sector. And let me finish just to say that we are suffering like 5 crises at the same time. We have a COVID-19 crisis, a geopolitical crisis, a climate change crisis, a food crisis, and also a trust crisis. So we have so many challenges ahead, and I think it's important to have this type of dialogue with other multilaterals to learn from other regions and try to implement the policy reforms that our citizens require. Thank you very much, Masood.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think it's really quite striking, the picture that Eric paints. You know, we start off from a really difficult situation in terms of inequality in the region. And as he said, you know, the richest 10% had 27 times of the poorest 50% average income. And now it's got worse for all these crises. So I think a question I'll come back to, Eric, maybe in a second round is, on current policies in the region and on current prospects, if we look forward 5 years from now and 10 years from now, do you think that there's any likelihood of inequality in the region being any less severe than it is now? Do you think things are going to get better on current policies, or do the countries need to change their policies to get a better outcome in 5 years and 10 years' time? So I'd like to put you a little bit on the spot and ask you that. Let me now turn to Eric, the other Eric, with K now. So Eric Bergloff. And Eric, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the lessons that you had drawn about how to balance the desire for efficiency and growth with the concerns about inequality. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that, but also if you wanted to reflect a bit on your history in the transition economies, where inequality grew quite rapidly in some of them after they tried to become market economies. It'd be great, I'm sure, for the audience to get your perspective. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Masood, and thank you for your general introduction before, and very honored to be part of this group, and of course to be part of this event, and many greetings to Karat Kelipeto. So I worked, as you said, for a long time at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and that bank was set up to deal with the issue of transition from planned economies to market economies, and in many ways it was about breaking up some of these often very inefficient but still very important social arrangements that were there in place at the time, and where enterprises were responsible for basically everything in people's lives, and that was of course not the best way to organize social welfare and get the best economic growth either, and often didn't provide the right incentives. So, but that all really, and the emphasis was very much on getting growth going, becoming more efficient, getting rid of all those value-reducing activities and so on. And that experience shaped the EBRD in the early years also. So there wasn't so much attention to this issue that you very rightly raised, that what really happened in terms of inequality was in some cases really staggering. If you look at what happened in the early years in Russia, what happened in Ukraine, and actually also what happened in China. So there was a lot to be thought about, but it wasn't actually until EBRD was drawn into first Turkey and then North Africa that the attention to these issues, it was mostly about inclusion, but it was also about inequality in a more general sense. And I thought I would give you sort of kind of 5 lessons that I drew from that experience, and I think I try to use them now when I think about how can infrastructure be part of transforming communities and bridging this gap between the rich and the poor. And so the first one is that when we use the word inequality, we should really talk about inequalities, because inequality comes, it doesn't, economic inequality does not come alone. It comes with inequality of access to health, or access to education. It comes often with other forms of deprivation as well. So I think that's a very important insight when we are trying to so it's not enough just to raise people's income, and certainly when we want to improve people's well-being and life satisfaction, we need to think about a much broader range of issues. And actually one thing that we had a chance to do during my time at EBRD was to start a combined household and attitudinal survey called the Life in Transition Survey. We kind of mapped out these connections. And I think for me, that was a very important insight, and that we need to think of this as a cluster of inequalities. The second thing that I took away from that experience was that, of course, both equality of outcome and equality of opportunity are very important. But actually, when you try as a development institution, or maybe even more generally, try to address inequality, it's easier to make progress when you talk about inequality of opportunity, because that's something that everyone sort of across the spectrum, the idea that things that you have no control over, where you were born, what gender you have, what ethnic background you have, and so who are your parents, that shouldn't have an impact on your outcome in life. And that, I think, it was when we had that equality opportunity that we managed to change the direction of EBRD in this space. It was really the equality opportunity. It became an efficiency issue. It was an issue that, if you have so many people outside the labor force, like we saw, particularly when we came into Turkey, North Africa, where 80% of women were outside the official labor force. That is an enormous waste of resources. And of course, anything that sort of prevents people with disabilities or whatever from participating actively in the economy is inefficiency. And that is, I think, is a very important insight. But it's not only that it's the logic is better, and that can bring me to the third lesson. That it's also that it's actually quite easy to substantiate. It's easy to measure, both at the micro level and to integrate it into project outcomes, and also at the macro level. So we know how to measure this. What is the degree of inequality of opportunity in different countries? It's much easier to really have an agreement on that. Of course, we have many measures also for inequality of outcome, but still, I think the really important issues around equality of opportunity, we have better handle on. The fourth lesson, and I will be brief, is that it's not only that inequality is a very multidimensional concept that involves both equality of opportunity and outcome, but it's also about a political and social process, and that people are part of shaping these economies and having influence over their lives. And this is a very important aspect of inclusion and inequality, when people feel that they are being deprived from participation. And that's something that I think we can do throughout the project, how we design them, how we involve communities when we design them. And I think that is also the way that and that brings my fifth lesson and the last lesson is that, that's the way that we create a sense of fairness, because people are actually willing, surprisingly perhaps, but to accept quite a lot of inequality of outcome and even of opportunity if the process is perceived to be fair. The fact that people can be part of shaping in various ways, shaping society, shaping their immediate communities and so on. And being part of shaping the kind of infrastructure that you are going to develop. And there are a lot of examples of this, and I can maybe, if there is time for a second round, I would like to show some examples of how digital technology can be part of really addressing these and helping us to get bridging the gap between the poor and the rich. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I think Eric made a very important point that I remember we go back 15 years and you had a conversation about this topic. Many people would say, our concern is to help people who are poor. We need to reduce the level of people who are living in absolute poverty, whether it's under $1 a day or $2 a day. And as long as our programs and our efforts are achieving that, in a way, what's happening above that income level is not as relevant for people to think about. So the focus was on poverty rather than on inequality. And now, I think we discovered that that was only a partially true. That actually people were concerned not just about poverty, the people who were very poor, but they were also concerned about inequality in all the dimensions that Eric mentioned. And as countries became richer, so there were more and more people moving out of absolute poverty, in fact, it didn't mean that people were no longer concerned about inequality. In many ways, in middle-income countries, they were even more concerned about inequality. So I think that's an important evolution in the way people thought that Eric has rightly pointed to, alluded to. Let me now finally turn to Rolf Strack, and Rolf gives a little bit of European perspective. Everybody thinks of the European model as being less unequal than, say, a North American approach. But of course, in Europe also recently, there has been, as a result of the pandemic, increase in inequality. So, Rolf, could we turn to you, please, for your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you, Masood. I hope you can understand me properly. That works, does it?
Works very well, Rolf. We can hear you and
Very
see
good.
you.
So thank you for the invitation and for having the opportunity to share the European perspective. I want to share some slides in also order to calibrate what we see in Europe in comparison to the other regions. But what I can say already is that there is this common concern about protecting the vulnerable in the current environment. And let me also share where it comes from and how we look at it from our perspective here. I hope it works very quickly. I hope you can see the slides. Can you?
Not yet. Not yet. We can see you very clearly, but not your slides.
So then I give it another try.
Let's try again.
If not, it's out.
Hang on. We may be. No, I think
Okay.
you have been replaced by me, which is even worse. So I think we are looking at the slides.
Let's just stop it.
Okay.
So we concede to a technology, no way. But I can tell the story anyway, or the important arguments. I think for us, for Europeans, as a starting perspective, what we are faced with, and Europe more than other regions, is a huge terms of trade shock. And this terms of trade shock means that we export our income, that we export wealth. And we look at the other regions, the same happens in some variation with Asia, and to a much different degree also in Latin America, but obviously it's a lot of a question on the issue is whether you are a commodity exporter or importer. For Europe, it's a net loss. And the question is, who has to can we compensate for that loss, and who has to bear the cost of that loss? And it will be affecting the vulnerable. Now, when we look where we come from with the pandemic, it is very clear that Europe had pretty much advanced in the recovery. So compared to other regions, we were much closer in actually getting to pre-pandemic trends. And this has been also the result of a tremendous effort done at the European level, done at the national level. And I was listening carefully also to what Eric said about Latin America, because the European experience is actually that overall, with in-country inequality, has not increased substantially with the pandemic. And that is the consequence also of very, very sizable government measures. At some stages of the pandemic, in several countries, European countries, basically 1/3 or even more of the workforce were in publicly supported labor schemes that kept them on the job. And that helped tremendously to avoid some of the scarring that one would have otherwise expected from the pandemic. So that is in a way a rather favorable starting point for now entering this second shock that we see on the supply side and coming with terms of trade. Now here with the second shock, we see indeed that disposable income of people is declining. Wages are not picking up and cannot pick up at the same level as inflation. Inflation dispersion is tremendous in the euro area. So we have on average 8% inflation. We have, however, countries with more than 20% or close to 20%, and on the opposite side, about 5% inflation. So there's a big dispersion, and there cannot be compensation for that. For us, again, the people that will be suffering most of it are those lower social groups or more vulnerable social groups that have lower incomes and that just consume a higher part in terms of the income for energy and for food. And we see this, and at the same time, in a way, I'm obviously also very conscious that when we look at the European experience, this is in the percentage range of below 20%, 15%, and in the higher income sphere, obviously much less. But this is still very low compared to what you see in other regions and in emerging markets where these shares are substantively higher. So in that regard, there is some resilience. Government reaction to that has again also been pretty clearly in supporting the vulnerable. Almost all countries in Europe have taken those measures. And that is a good point. However, at the same time, we are facing in terms of short-term reaction still the complication that in a monetary union, you cannot count as much on monetary policy in taming the inflation in your own country. So that there is the question of what fiscal policies can also do in this regard in order to prevent a further loss or a disproportionate loss of disposable income. And here a very clear constraint, also because the measures taken during the pandemic turned out to be financially, obviously, very costly and haven't driven up debt levels. This is what governments face in the short term, and there is great consensus in having this common approach in giving support to the vulnerable. In the medium term, I think it's also clear that there is an agenda of getting more strategic independence in terms of energy, and that obviously is related a lot to the question of the European exposure to Russian energy. And there is a clear agenda towards digitalization as well. And I'm happy in the second round to tell more about those European macro initiatives towards the greening of the economy and towards digitalization that at the same time have a redistributive impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rolf. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left. I'd like to come back to our panelists for a quick response on some points and maybe